I don't want to distract at all from that critical focus on remaining below 1.5. That's got to be steadfast in our work, but also it has to be paired with the recognition that we're in a changed climate. So I think what our focus within GRP is a recognition that if we're not advancing adaptation and resilience in equal partnership with mitigation, then we will derail our efforts in mitigation.
It's not this or that. We need to do both, but recognizing that if we want the world to thrive, people need special needs and support while we go and we tap the fossil fuel companies and we achieve 1.5. But now some communities are flooding and they are frying and the heat is coming, and we need to really prepare them for that.
Welcome back, everybody. Richard Baker, founder of Collector Responsibility, here today with another episode of Sustainable Ambassador Podcast. Through this podcast, I'm speaking with ambassadors around the world about their work in environment, society, economy, and community, looking to solve the challenges that they see within their cities, communities, and countries. Through this episode, I'm joined by two incredible leaders in the resilience and youth activism area, Joshua Amponsem and Nate Matthews. Joshua is a Ghanaian climate activist and is the founder of Green Africa Youth Organization and the co-director for the Youth Climate Justice Fund. Nathan Matthews is the CEO at the Global Resilience Partnership, a group of over 80 diverse organizations advancing resilience through identifying, scaling on the ground innovations, generating and sharing knowledge, and shaping policy. Honestly, thank you very much, both of you, for taking the time. I know we're working on 3 continents, 3 time zones, but before we kind of get into the work itself, it'd be great as a starting point if each of you could kind of introduce yourselves and a little about the work that you're doing and how you got into it.
So thanks so much for having us. And so, as you mentioned, I'm Nate Matthews, the CEO of the Global Resilience Partnership. I'm Canadian by birth, but have been abroad for about 25 years. GRP, we're a partnership we were founded 10 years ago. We aim across the partnership to bring work on innovation, knowledge, and policy together and to really ensure that we're more than the sum of our parts.
It's really nice to be here. My name is Joshua. I'm from Ghana. Most of our work at the Green Africa Youth Organization started in 2013, and we formally registered in 2015. And the reason for what we do was really realizing that climate change has a huge impact on young people in the future, and at the same time recognizing that young people have enormous energy and potential to really become frontiers of new solutions. And part of that work was working with students and communities and local governments, and eventually stepping into the international community of really demonstrating African leadership, specifically focusing on adaptation and resilience. And that is because when you look at the continent and you look at the impact of climate on the continent, it just almost make it very direct and such an urgency and catalyzing different opportunities that allow for communities to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And that took me on to eventually setting up also with colleagues, the Youth Climate Justice Fund, as a means of providing financial resources to young people so that they have the resources they need to drive the change that is actually part of their everyday life. And that comes naturally and organically to them as the impact of climate change comes to their doorstep.
What catalyzed you into this work, into the roles that you're taking now?
I finished my undergraduate degree back in 1999, and I took a gap year after that. I spent a year, we're doing various jobs in different countries in Africa. And then I ended up spending 6 years in Japan running a business in a completely unrelated field in accommodation management. And it was when I was in Japan that I was deeply reflecting on that time in Africa and traveling around to various countries, meeting people, seeing the amazing biodiversity on the ground there. And it was such a pull, and it was such a formative time for me when I was there that it made me realize that that's where my heart and my passion was. And so I decided to sell my business and do a master's degree in international development and environmental analysis. And that was really just the no turn back point.
My journey started as a university student in the undergrad. I think I heard the word climate change when I was in my second year, and just hearing about global warming, sea level rise, the impact of climate, and connecting that to the community that I came from, I immediately felt a sense of there is a role here that local communities who we talk about in this context actually are living this reality. And typically, they are not even referenced enough. At that point, it became very sort of compelling for us to get out of the class, and I convened a team. And as a group of students, we went into communities and started hearing from their perspective. And I think that really was a student association. But then after school, I was working in the government office as a waste management officer, sanitation officer. And I think that in that process, I saw a connection between waste and climate and rivers and oceans and sort of this very broader global environmental change that was happening, and further to work as a consultant for private sector initiatives, working in agribusiness, in renewable energy. And I think across all these spaces, from the government office to the private sector, I saw that there is a big role that society has to play, and that is really serving as a catalyst to drive change. So I went back and we formalized this association of students to become a formal NGO that started working very concretely with municipalities in driving some of these actions, and got this very strong conviction that it will always come back to communities, and our biggest investment being communities. And that became sort of almost a career path in that sense. Yeah.
My first NGO is in the community space, and I find that that's often one of the least discussed topics when it comes to climate change. But one of the topics that is covered more and more now is resilience and adaptation. And I'm curious, both of you are advocates for that versus saying trying to stop climate change. And I'm wondering why the switch? Why are you some of the few organizations that are really advocating vocally for resilience and adaptation now versus trying to stop the train before it reaches 1.5?
I don't want to distract at all from that critical focus on remaining below 1.5. That's got to be steadfast in our work, but also it has to be paired with the recognition that we're in a changed climate. So I think what our focus within GRP is a recognition that if we're not advancing adaptation and resilience in equal partnership with mitigation, then we will derail our efforts in mitigation. And also for me, the resilience and adaptation space is where climate meets community.
I think the reality is that when you talk about phasing out fossil fuel and 1.5, I think it's what we need because mitigation is the best shot. And across West Africa and the Sahel region, we've seen an over of 4 to 5 degrees, and even 1 degree increase is still a lot to do. When we're talking about up to 5 degrees increase, and we're talking about communities going as much as 44 degrees, and we're talking about people who are selling on the street and they spend a lot of their time outdoors. It is crazy, and I think this is where the need for adaptation is super important. And it's not this or that. We need to do both, but recognizing that if we want the world to thrive, people need special needs and support while we go and we tap down the fossil fuel companies and we achieve 1.5, and we will go overboard and we can come back again and stay within certain safer limits. But now some communities are flooding and they are frying and the heat is coming, and we need to really prepare them for that.
How difficult is it to get the message that we need to focus on adaptation, focus more on adaptation, focus it in parallel? How hard is it to get that message across to people without them saying you're not being hopeful? Is that a challenge now, or are you finding that more and more people are opening up to that conversation as the science is showing that we're already past 1.5, at least for 1 yearly average, and risking more going forward?
I think keeping 1.5 alive is still essential. I understand that we've gone past it, and I understand we will overshoot it. But if we start to talk about 2.5 to 2.7, what we're seeing at an Earth with that kind of increase in medium temperature is 1/3 of the planet completely uninhabitable, a collapse of the Amazon, a collapse of the Greenland ice sheet, 9+ meters of sea level rise. At this point, it's almost not worth imagining, because I think we have to focus on the 1.5. So I think we have to recognize that, yeah, we're going past it right now, but we have to get back to it. So it's a recognition that we will overshoot, but that still has to be our firm North Star.
It's a global debate that is very tricky. Now, the reason for that is that who was the 1.5 for, right? And I think that when the special report 1.5 came in 2019, I believe, I think that insinuation of 1.5 was not even something for everybody. As much as you try to quantify a global phenomena into one messaging, you lose a lot in that process. And this is why 1.5, even though it was a sweet target, it was still very disastrous for many communities. The difficult part with the messaging, what you're asking about, is getting the community on both sides, on those who are seeing the impact in its extreme forms now, and those who are seeing the impact in very minute forms, to come together to say that we need to invest to protect those who are on the front lines and seeing the extreme versions of the impact, telling those who are seeing the minute versions that they need to prepare for extreme versions, and at the same time, cutting down emissions. This is extremely difficult. But having said that, I think that we're beginning to see a minor shift. Of course, there's still a huge adaptation finance gap that is there. There's still a huge gap even in technology transfers relating to adaptation. And then trust in resourcing communities directly to be able to facilitate this. But I think that it's super essential that we really make sure that we do not start getting the message wrong, that we can really go overboard and we're going to be fine, because we are not going to be fine. And I think really being able to do that in protection, resilience, adaptation, and human security as a whole, and reducing emissions in a way that we can go back to within safer limits, I think that should be our key focus.
Can you, the way that you communicate then, can you be big picture, or do you really have to speak nuanced pictures by the communities, talking about specific regions, and then layering that back up into the global conversation?
In the last 3 to 4 years, we're seeing the implications of it globally, and the conversation has really changed. It's been helped by the fact that we're in an El Nino, which is pushing temperatures up even further and causing more extreme events. But at least I'm seeing that certainly on a recognition more globally, that these impacts aren't just a problem for people who are far away. They're a problem at home now as well. And, we see big implications across the US, crops through to fires, through to floods across Europe as well. And I think these are only going to ramp up.
I absolutely agree. I think if you look at the protests in Poland with farmers, if you look at, the floods in Pakistan, if you look at the floods in Germany, if you look at the heat in France and Italy and across Europe, and the heat waves in the US as well, and fires, I think it raises that concern and it makes it very vibrant and very visible. I think that at every point in time, we go down to the nuances to really showcase the extreme versions of these, because the issue is the incident of a wildfire or a flood. It's a question of the capacity of where those incidents happen to respond to these sort of events. And I think that because, of course, certain countries have a higher capacity to respond, it might not be as vibrant as a debate as compared to a country that doesn't have this capacity. And I think that cumulatively being able to draw some of these nuances together, project them, go back to the bigger picture as a global community, but also being able to say specifically in the island states, this is a huge issue that needs to be resolved ASAP, and saying that, okay, from a geopolitical perspective and all the tensions with different social issues happening, we need to accelerate action to make sure that people are safe. I think this is super important. If not, we could lose ourselves, even in the climate community ourselves, and not realize, the different minute issues that really specifically, acutely affect certain communities, and while we could also have very slow creeping impact that could happen in other places where it might not be as urgent and as dire.
So in that regard, Joshua, I'm just going to ask you, who should be leading this, this change and this charge and catalyzing the talks about adaptation? Is it local communities that should just take hold of this and just accept their fate? Or is there an opportunity here for new leadership to really take control of this and say, look, we need a new way and we need to start moving faster?
I think that we've gotten to the point where it has to be everybody, because the leadership has been shown. It's a question of the finances that is going to drive this. And sometimes I don't like putting everything on finance, but the reality is that you need the finance to make it move. And that is the hard truth. So the leadership is there. They've shown, they've communicated the impact. They've communicated beyond the impact. And this is very important to mention. I think that what the countries that are seeing this extreme impact, what they're also communicating, that they are the same countries which hold the ecosystems that are critical for the global community. And I think this is powerful to realize that it's not just impact to them and we have to protect them, but it's also their capacity to protect the ecosystems, the biomes that serves the entire global community, including supply chains for private sector and for that drives certain economies. And I think that putting it into perspective like this is super important to realize that, because typically it's seen from it's a vulnerable country and we need to provide some money to protect people. No, it's not just a vulnerable country. It's a country that is serving a global community with resources, infrastructure, ecosystem services that allow the entire globe to run and to thrive. And if there is a situation where those ecosystems will cease to exist, then we are all in a bigger problem as well. I think all of that should be backed with the right kind of action that allow things to accelerate, because the conversations have been happening, they will keep happening. But being able to accelerate the action that is needed to go with this is still missing. And I think that is critical.
So we're founding signatories of the locally led adaptation principle. So a real strong endorsement that local communities need to take both ownership and be given, the agency to be able to drive the changes that are needed on the ground. But that has to work in partnership with governments and with corporate. A lot of people put adaptation and resilience in the risk mitigation sphere, and I think that's too narrow of a definition or too narrow of an understanding. We also have to recognize that there's a big opportunity and there's a lot of tailwinds for companies coming into this space to invest, to bring revenues. They can do that in partnership with communities and then also in partnership with the public sector, because there's a big de-risking role that the public sector is willing to play here too. It's got to be a partnership approach because that's the only way to tackle a big crisis like this.
Joshua, you're really on the front lines of this. Your communities are the ones that are being impacted. You're seeing 45, 50 degrees. Nate, I mean, you're fighting for these organizations, but you're not on the front lines right now. So how does that change the way that each of you approach the work that you're doing?
I think I'm waking up every day thinking, what are the new solutions that are there? What are known solutions that are there that are working, and how do we catalyze that? And I think for me, that is what agency should make people do. Agency should drive you to look at what is working and invest more in that. What is not working, kick that out of the box, improve it, evaluate it, come back stronger, best, and keep moving. And I think that when you think about it from that perspective, we know that certain things are strongly working, right? Protecting sensitive ecosystems that people rely on for livelihood. And not everything will come from structural engineering. Not everything will come from sort of the big macro World Bank into multilateral banking facilities. Some of them, and this is something me and Nate agree on so much, some of them will rely on the micro to medium scale investment that is trusted in the right hands of people who know what works for them and who really have the ownership of their community and want to stay within their community and want to thrive within their community. For me, this is super important, and we're not doing enough of that. So this is the first thing that I wake up every day, I'm thinking about this. Secondly, I think the whole world is struggling with ambitious leadership in government, in private sector, even in civil society. Ambitious leadership that allow us to really pursue paths that allow us to enhance our understanding on solutions. And I think that our language every day when we wake up should be solutions, solutions, solutions. So I feel like really the agency part of me is waking up and thinking solutions, 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 and understanding what are the new things that we need to invest in, we need to understand.
Nate, how do you control 80 organizations that look just like Joshua? Full of passion, deep in the community roots. How do you organize them? How do you bring them together? How do you help them move forward when you're gonna have a real spectrum of ideas and activities and excitement and funding needs? Like how do you support them?
But it's like Joshua said, it's that innovation. I was in Kenya last week and we were meeting, partners on the ground that we're supporting, and like that stuff they're doing is just phenomenal, in the changes in agriculture and agroforestry and ecosystem support and just around the globe, there's so much changing. And this is, we've got to recognize it's also the biggest economic transformation that, in human history that we're going through right now. And there will certainly be laggards in that, but there's so many people leaning into it and really exciting. And so as a partnership, it's such a privilege to be able to work with so many leaders like Joshua and others and find ways where we see matchmaking or we see support where we can lend that catalytic bit of support to it or help elevate voices through like the Resilience Hub at the COP or do various things to just engage and even just help them to share knowledge so that they can learn from each other and move forward. So it's certainly a pleasure.
Joshua, you mentioned that you wake up and you try and kick everything that's broken out of the box. I have been on the ground for many years, and I find that the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the nonprofits, the locally rooted communities, even if there's some inefficiency, they work their way through it pretty quickly because they're trying to solve a real need. But as we get higher up in the global hierarchy of organizations and leaders, and you start to see a lot less of that. And I'm curious, where do you see things that are broken? Where are things that really where are the opportunities to drive things faster?
I think one of the things I will immediately say is trust, and I don't say that as a very sort of easy word here. I think that a lot of the things I've seen regarding the catalyst that is required to scale things have to do with hesitation that typically comes from the lack of trust, and that is not just in the financial sector, but it's also in the way projects are even developed and implemented. And I think that as it stands now, it's 2024, and you will still, come across Africa and you see a lot of projects still being pioneered, led, implemented to sometimes even to the very final bits, all with international consultants or all with sort of international input, with absolutely disregard for local leadership. And there's a report that I read, I think last year, September, which said that giving 50,000 USD unrestricted funding to a local community, right, goes a long way to them than giving them as much as $500,000 restricted. Controlled by the donor, defined by the donor, taking away any sense of sort of proactivity, leadership, and wisdom from the local communities, right? And I think for me, this is really something that is so broken that we need to fix to be able to ensure and entrust sort of resources in those who are actually living this reality.
I completely agree on the trust issue. I think that's a huge part. And I think what maybe as an add-on to that is just courage in leadership not from communities, because they have that. They're the ones taking the biggest risks here. But from the groups like the big international NGOs, the likes of the multilaterals and others, to really say the system isn't working. In a sense, a lot of these big international NGOs are doing great work, but they've got, thousands and tens of thousands of people in some cases employed through them. And so they're a huge drain on the resources that need to go to the ground. They're kind of reinforcing the current system, instead of actually making the transformation that we need. And so I'd like to see more courage as well.
What's the opportunity for the next generation of organizations to really come up and take leadership and help drive real solutions on the ground? Like, is this an opportunity for both you and your organizations to disrupt the old guard and to disrupt old models and to bring something new?
Yeah, I think from our perspective as a partnership, like, our biggest success is when one of our partners is just, doing amazing, get the next big tranche of funding, or they get a big global award, or they've just done a huge amount of impact. And so that is a great feeling. And that's one of the wonderful things about working in a partnership, because we get 80 organizations and we just get to see them flourishing, and we get to help them when we can. But, it's really about their leadership. So I think that's a really great thing about, working across 80 plus partners.
So what makes for a good partnership for you, Nate? Like, how do you identify the groups you want to work with? How do you make sure they be good partners? Like, what are some of the signals to what could be a great partnership? And what's the process for managing ongoing a partnership once you've launched?
So I think what we always look for is substantive partnerships. We're not looking for people just to join and have a logo, sharing a logo or whatever. It's got to be substantive. So we need to find that meaningful connection of what we're working on together and link to our themes. We're not trying to do everything within GRP. We call ourselves a global resilience partnership, but there's people who are focused on, resilience work, maybe be it in cities or transport or things like that we don't really engage with. So I think it's finding that substantive engagement focused on impact, and with good people. I think, that's the other key bit to partnerships. You've got to be working with good people.
Josh, what do you get from GRP and from others that are great partners? How do you, engage? How do you maintain? How do you make sure that you've got, equal footing in these partnerships?
I think that, I don't need an equal partnership. I think it's something that should be there. I think it's not something I need to ask as a grassroots organization. No, I don't need to ask, because you are using the narrative to build your entity. So you owe it to me to come to me already acknowledging my leadership, trust, right, expertise, wisdom, and approaching and working with me. And I feel like if every sort of international entity or foreign NGO or sort of a northern entity, Western entity, will approach local communities like this, it provides harmony for growth. It provides a space where you come up with some of the best ideas that you could ever implement. Because the thing is that most local communities do not have the exposure, right, that an organization based in the North will have. That is the reality, doubled with the local insights of what needs to happen on the ground. Their potential is enormous. And I think that in many cases, that is what I've seen. I've seen it from organizations that really take the time to reach out and say, I heard this, I saw that, I see this, I'm thinking about this, let's have a chat. What can we do together, right? What is your expertise and what is my expertise? I think coming from a position of strength and abundance is very, very important. And I think this is what happens in a lot of these entities where you go in and then you send a form, a questionnaire, you want to get at something. No, have a conversation, like be human, like literally. It is the most minimum thing that we can do in terms of positive partnerships, and create space for local communities and local groups to share what is important to them. Fold your strategy, put it in a microwave. Just make space and just ask, what is meaningful to you? And if it doesn't align, then it doesn't align.
You're talking to a future leader, someone young, coming out of school, maybe a young professional, a couple years. Resilience adaptation is their space. They want to solve real problems. What are 2 or 3 pieces of advice you'd give them to get a little bit further in the path, to have a higher success rate, to hopefully catalyze that change?
I think one of the things that I found very important is that you cannot change something until you understand it. And I think that the risk that I see with emerging leaders and young people is the rush to become experts of everything, but also not know. And that is, then you end up with, in adaptation, we say maladaptation, but you literally end up with a lot of inefficient solutions that leads to bigger problems than actually building power, building the people power, building the community power, and building the systematic changes that is needed to drive some of these big scale things. So my one thing that I definitely really encourage any emerging person thinking about adaptation, resilience, and the climate crisis and the political crisis as a whole is be patient in learning and understanding and knowing, because without that, you could have fantastic ideas and solutions, but you will have a lot of risk, and you will end up probably causing more problems than solutions.
For me, I would say two things. Persistence, I think, is key. So that's persistence in finding the right people. There's so many good people out there who you will eventually find. And so not to get discouraged by, somebody who might brush you off or not respond to your email. And then the second thing I would say for emerging leaders is there's such an interest from experienced leaders to be seen with emerging leaders now, especially with youth. And so to use the agency and the power you have in that moment. If somebody asks you for a picture, or they want to shake your hand, don't let that moment go by without asking something from them. And so I always encourage youth to don't get caught up with just taking a photo with somebody or being slotted into a 2 or 3 minute point. Demand more, demand that, and you'll get it, because you actually have quite a lot of power.